Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CELPIP Live. Let's get right into our trivia question for the day. The vernal equinox falls on March 19, 2024. What does the Latin word equinox mean in English? Let me know the answer in the comments below. As always, if you got it right, I will share it towards the end of our segment. Okay, let's get into what we're talking about today. If you're new here, CELPIP Live is an interactive YouTube series made to help CELPIP test takers like you understand a little bit more about the CELPIP test. So please subscribe to our channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as we go live. In today's episode, we're talking about CELPIP scoring. Now, we cannot talk about all aspects of our scoring for obvious security reasons, and we'll talk a little bit more about that during the episode. But we've collected most commonly asked questions from all of you, and we were actually able to get our scoring team to provide answers. They couldn't join us here today, but we have a familiar face helping us with the responses to your scoring questions. So let's go say hello to her. Hello, hello. Welcome to our show.
Hello, Ashwati. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here. As you said, Ashwati, our scoring team can't be here today as they are up to their eyeballs in projects and workloads, but they were very helpful to help us plan today's episode, give us lots of helpful information, and I am very happy to be here to share some of those details with you and answer your questions.
So I'll get started. I'll get started with the first question immediately. As we go through this episode and towards the end of the episode, you're going to have more questions about scoring, and we'll try our best to provide answers for that. But just know that if there's something that we cannot answer, we're just not going to be able to answer you, because not everything can be made public. So let me start with the first question. This was something that one of you asked us during our last CELPIP Live episode. What do raters think of test takers using a template for their writing responses? Would an answer without a template do better than one with a template if all other parameters are the same?
Okay, it's a very common question. And again, for viewers that maybe don't know me, I'm Brandy. I'm an instructor for the CELPIP test. So I deliver a lot of instructional language episodes and test strategies. So when I deliver my own webinars to help people study, I get this question all the time. And I always say to them, well, a template, if you're looking just to memorize answers and hope to force those memorized ideas into your own test when you take CELPIP, you're probably not going to do that well, in the sense that the ideas that you've memorized might not have anything to do at all with the question on the test that you've been given to answer. So remember, the whole point of doing a language proficiency test is to gauge your ability with your language skills, and that requires spontaneity. So in the real world, when somebody asks you a question, or in the workplace when you're asked to consider something and respond, of course, you're doing that on the spot. You wouldn't have time to go back and look at a memorized response and try to force that in. So I always say, from a content standpoint, and with all of your details, it's much better to just read and consider what your test question in that moment is asking you, and to come up with details that are very appropriate. Now, a template in that regard, if we're just talking about memorized ideas, I always say that's not a great way to go for a CELPIP test, or for any test. That if you're looking at using an outline per se, from my language instructor standpoint, an outline is your understanding of the structure of a response. And I think part of your success in any language proficiency test is, yes, having strong English skills, but also knowing the structure of the questions that you're answering. So in speaking task 1, for example, you're always going to be giving advice to somebody. So it's perfectly fine. And I think it would be good practice to prepare at home a structure on how you might give advice. So coming into your own test with phrases that you understand and make sense, such as, if I was giving advice to a friend right now, I might say, oh, one thing to consider before you take your trip overseas is, have you considered taking out travel insurance, just in case something goes wrong? So again, coming in with these structural ideas is perfectly fine. That's different though than a template. So yeah, memorization isn't great. Another element I always remind my test takers in session, and our scoring team has also reminded us as well, the danger of using memorized responses and templates on your actual test could set you up at a disadvantage, because if lots of different test takers somehow get their hands on that same templated memorized response, and everybody uses the same ideas and the same phrases, whether it's writing or speaking, those repetition in phrases, those can be flagged as answers on a test that are possibly copied or plagiarized. And then if your test gets flagged for security purposes, you risk losing your test altogether. It might be thrown out, and all of your preparation and the registration fees you've paid for this test is for naught. So I just caution you when you're preparing, be prepared and know what the test will ask of you, but come in prepared to deliver your own ideas on the spot that actually answer the question. You'll fare much better from a language standpoint for sure. That's a great question to start the show off, Ishwati. It's an important point. And again, we get that question all the time. So it's a great one to know.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How many raters go through one answer sheet? So this is only for writing and speaking. And then obviously, Brandy will talk more about that.
Yeah. So the listening and reading test, by the way, is scored by the computer. So none of the raters are ever going to even see those portions of your test. The raters, these are human raters for CELPIP. The raters are going to assess your writing and your speaking. So for the writing test, you have 2 different writing tasks to complete. You're going to have at least 4 different raters assess those scores, up to a maximum of 6. For the speaking, it's 3 raters minimum, up to a maximum of 5 different raters. And these are different people. The raters themselves work independently from one another. So again, if you've got, say, 4 raters looking at those 2 writing tasks, each individual rater has no idea who else is rating the writing pieces and what scores they're giving. It's a completely anonymous, completely independent process. And that safeguards the fairness and the validity of the test scores as well. So for writing, for example, if you've got 4 experienced and professionally trained raters who know the CELPIP test inside and out, and have all agreed upon the writing level for your writing task, if they all agree, it's a very strong indication that that's the proficiency level that you're working at. So that's why it's done that way. And again, the raters don't even have a name on your test to assess. They literally are given the writing responses, or perhaps the speaking recordings that you've made as well. You're literally a barcode to them, or a registration number. They don't even see the name. They have no idea who you are. So as I say, it's done completely anonymously to safeguard the privacy and also enhance the validity of the scores too.
Did you share how many raters go through a test?
Yeah. Okay. So for writing, you'll have at least 4, up to a maximum of 6. Mm-hmm. For the speaking, it'll be at least 3, up to a maximum of 5. And by the way, the writing and speaking raters are different. You would never have a rater assess both parts of that test. They're 2 completely different pools of raters, and that's also important to note.
I see. Good to know. We already spoke about this. You just answered it 2 seconds ago, but I will ask you again. What information does the rater get about the test taker? Do they know the location, ethnicity, or background of the test taker?
Nope, they don't even know your name. As I say, it's completely anonymous, and for those reasons, it safeguards your own privacy, but it also assures that the score that you're receiving is based on your language ability. So there is no way possible that the raters will know what country you're living in now, or what country you were born and raised in, what your name is. None of those factors are ever visible to the raters, no.
When I was giving a test, I've given a lot of English language tests. I'm an immigrant. I've been an immigrant in multiple countries, and so I've had to give a lot of English tests. But I remember for one of my tests, my tutor just asked us casually in the class, like, when you are writing a letter or when you're writing an email response, do you sign your own name? And like 90% of us said, yes, we do. And he was like, don't. Like, why do you want to sign your own name? Like, the whole point of, like, you have the option to be anonymous. So, just sign a simple name. And this, what you just said, kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, that's what I would do on any test as well. I would just make up a name. And if you take any of our writing webinars, you'll see that. Some of the names that come to my mind, I've seen from test takers. One name was Lucas McTeacher. One name was Mrs. Appleby, and so on. So sometimes people have fun with the names, and that's okay. When you're writing an email, you need a signature, yes, but it
Yes.
really doesn't matter what the name is. So you don't have to use your own. And that's a fair point that Ashwati makes, for sure.
Okay. So the next question is along the same lines of the previous question, kind of talking about the background of the TT. Our reader is biased towards the North American accent and pronunciation during the speaking test. Words are pronounced differently across different countries.
Yeah, so if I may, I've got my colleague Neil in the background. Could we put up the speaking performance standards if that's possible? Just there, perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. So I'm showing the audience right now all of the different skills categories that are taken into account by the raters when they're listening to your recorded responses. So first of all, I should say, for people that are new to CELPIP, when you complete your speaking test, you're actually sitting at your computer workstation in the testing room, recording your answers into a microphone. So you're not actually speaking to the human raters that are later on going to give you a score. So the recordings you make during the test are sent off and listened to by the raters later on. So you're looking right now at a checklist of skills that the raters are going to listen in for. And they're trying to assess as many strengths as they can across those 4 areas. So your content details are taken into account, your vocabulary choice, your listenability is the speech part. We'll come to that in a second as your question asks, and also your task fulfillment. So the raters look for your strengths, and they're also going to assess the weaknesses too. And it becomes almost like a balancing act. Clearly, the more strengths you have across all 4 of these areas, the higher your score is going to be for your speaking responses. So if you can look at the listenability factor, that's the 3rd one down. If you look way over to the right-hand side under those important factors, you will see the word pronunciation, but you're going to see about 10 other ideas as well that go into the speech assessment. So pronunciation is one part of the score assessment, I suppose, for your responses, but there are so many others to be taken into account. So literally, the raters are going to ask themselves, can they understand the words that you are saying as you're speaking? And provided the answer is yes, then you've got nothing to worry about. There are so many, I don't want to say types of English, but English is spoken so widely around the world. I guess that's a more accurate way of saying that. And we come to Canada, a lot of us have different accents already. So imagine an Irish accent and a Scottish accent, Australian, South African, and even American accents are quite different than Canadian. But provided, even with whatever accent you're bringing to the table, as long as the raters can understand your speech, that's all that matters. Your actual accent itself is unimportant. It's always the big ticket items, keep in mind, that the raters are going to need to assess to give you a score. So minor mistakes aren't that big of a deal. If, on the other hand, within the pronunciation, it's very unclear and the raters are having a very difficult time understanding the words you're speaking, then yes, that is going to affect the score. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your accent. With whatever accent we speak, it's more a matter of stressing our words in the correct place. And we can learn those factors, again, with whatever pronunciation patterns we bring to the table. That's a great question, and I'm glad you've asked it. Thanks, Neil, for sharing with us the speaking performance standards. I think we could probably take it down for now. We can put it up later if you've got other questions. But it's nice to see the big picture as to see all the skills that the raters are looking at, pronunciation being one of them.
Yeah, so you might need that slide again because the next question is like along the same vein. So we talked about, like you just mentioned, people coming from Ireland or people coming from the US or people coming from the UK, for example. All of these are considered native English language countries. I don't know about Ireland, but definitely US and the UK. So is it then assumed that if they are a native English speaker, they would automatically score a level 11 or a level 12 since their pronunciation is perfect. Like it's what an English language education requires you to pronounce it. Yeah. So how should a native English speaker prepare for the CELPIP speaking test?
Yeah, that's another really great question to ask as well. I think it's almost a misconception. And I've had friends who have immigrated to Canada and they speak English as their first language. One girlfriend of mine comes to mind. She's from England. And she says to me, she acknowledges, she says, I was a little bit too overconfident. And she says, I assumed because English is my first language, I really didn't need to study or prepare. And I went in and I just did the test. And she said, I squeaked by. I got the bare minimum goal that I was aiming for. But she says, I didn't do half as well as I thought I would. And I reminded her, I said, that's because, and sorry, Neil, could we put up that speaking performance chart one more time? I said to her, well, you probably have the pronunciation, even though she's got this beautiful British accent. As Ashwati says, English is her first language. So even with that different accent to the Canadian one, her pronunciation patterns are fine. So we can check that one off the list. She probably did quite well for her pronunciation. Probably even her grammar and her syntax would have been okay as well. Because again, whatever language is our first language, we can usually speak those ideas quite fluently. But if you're not familiar with this exact score chart and you don't know that the raters are looking for you to demonstrate specific examples and details, so the more interesting and the more well thought out and supported your ideas are, the better the quality of your responses are going to be. So you would score better for content in that place. Just because English is your first language, if you don't include any supporting details at all, you're probably not going to do as well under content, for example, as you thought you might. And same with vocab. Again, if English is the first language, sure, the words that we select will very likely make sense and they'll be suitable for the meaning we convey. But once we look at this chart and we understand coming into CELPIP that to score our best, the raters are hoping to see from us very precise and specific vocabulary choice. So we're not going to use casual words like thing or stuff or person or building and all of the common words. Those words might make sense for the meaning, but once we learn that we're looking to step it up. So instead of a person, are we talking about a university professor, a taxi cab driver, a CELPIP test taker, for example? So once we learn to try our best to aim higher and incorporate those specific vocabulary choices into our score, we would score better there as well. And again, task fulfillment, whether you're a first language speaker or not, we need to answer the question on the test completely and fully. Sometimes a CELPIP question might have more than one focus. And in a question I do with my test takers in session, they're asked to give advice to somebody, but they have to explain, first of all, how they're going to get their colleague to speak to somebody you'd like to get to know. And then they have to explain what topics of conversation could be suitable for that situation. So we have to address both parts of that task. If we only gave a lot of topics and didn't even attend to how is your friend even going to start this conversation, our answer is not complete and we wouldn't score as well under task fulfillment. So again, whether English is your first language or not, we really do need to understand that it's a package deal. All four of these dimensions or skills categories will be considered to give you a score. And if you're aiming for the best score possible, then yes, you do need to practice these and understand the structure. And that really has nothing to do with whether English is your first language or not. So it's always helpful to prepare and know before you go. That's a good expression, I think. Anyway.
Thank you. One of our colleagues who provides your Get the Facts presentation. So we have a Get the Facts presentation. So for people who are who've just learned about the CELPIP test and want to know more about how it works before you even decide whether that's the test for you, you can just join any of the Get the Facts webinar and we will give you the facts of the test. But he compares this to, because he does this a lot and he gets this question almost all the time about oh, I'm a native English speaker, is it easier for me? And then he says it's like a driving test. If you say you're an amazing driver in your country and then you move to another country, you're not automatically going to pass the driving test. You need to learn the roads and you need to learn the rules of that country, even though you may be an exceptional driver. So that's kind of one way to look at this. You need to understand. Even it's also a good way to look at it if you've given other English tests, it's not the same.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to learn the test. You have to understand what the test is looking for because each test is looking for something different.
Right.
So you may be, even if you are not a native English speaker, you may be really good at the English language in general, but you need to know how to answer the question and what they're looking for in your answer.
Yeah, perfect. I have a quick question, Ashwati. I know you were born and raised in India. What side of the road do they drive in India? Is it left or right?
It's not the one here, so...
Okay, opposite. So you're on the left-hand side of the road then. Okay, got it.
This is like very bad because it's revealing my challenges with direction, but
Yeah,
it's the other, not this. It's whatever
opposite.
the
Yeah.
other. But I didn't drive in India, so I grew up in the Middle East, so I drove. They are the same as what's happening here. Like they have, because they had to import their cars and they imported like American, um, and then European and Japanese cars, and then so it was easier for them to just, even their road structure and their city planning is very influenced by the city planning in the U.S. or in North America, so they follow the rules here. So it was the same for me in terms of like comfort of driving, but the rules are not the same at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Like I can't imagine. We drive on the right-hand side of the road here, and our steering wheel's on the left-hand side of the car. But it would be opposite if I went to India. And I know there's so many more people in India. So your example's a perfect one I was thinking of as you were talking about that. Like if I went to India and just jumped in a vehicle and expected to drive like I would here in Canada, I'd probably cause an accident or get somebody hurt, including myself. So it's sort of
yeah,
like the test. Like even though driving is driving, you still need to learn the rules of the road and prepare in order to achieve your outcome. In that case, it's about safety. But the test analogy works the same as well. Know the structure and you'll do your best.
India is the same as the UK. So if you've like India and UK follow the same steering wheel and free turn rules. I think they're the if there's any other country that drives the same way as UK and that's not India, just let me know in the comments. But I feel
Yeah.
like I don't know about like our neighboring countries. Like I don't know how Nepal drives or Pakistan drives, but basically it's the same as the UK. And you could actually drive here. Like if you have a car that is where the steering wheel is on the other side, you can drive it here. You just have to follow the rules of this of Canada. So
Yeah.
that's I can't even imagine how confusing that would be.
I
If
know.
you
We have a guy, Clayton, in our comments box there, just mentioned Australia. And you're right, I've been to Australia and I do remember that as well. And I was a passenger. That's why I would not drive in Australia because it's backwards to me, right? And I thought, oh, I'm not ready for this. I've not studied. I've not prepared. So anyway, great analogy. Thanks so much for bringing that up. All
yeah, thank
right.
you for sharing. Good to know Australia.
Mhm.
Okay. So, how will my speaking score be affected if I can only think of one main detail for my response? Also, a question we got from the last episode. Good
Yeah. And
question.
again, I get this question all the time. So we saw that readers checklist, we know that content details are going to be a part of our score anyway. So usually when you're speaking on CELPIP, you're speaking for 1 full minute, so 60 seconds. On 2 different speaking tasks, you are going to have a 90-second response. So the idea is to fill up that speaking time with enough details that keep that response moving forward. So I recognize sometimes when we're in a test and we're nervous and our mind tends to blank sometimes, I understand that sometimes it is a little bit difficult to come up with that second main idea that's going to fill out the rest of your time. If that happens, here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to just give up and stop talking. I don't want you to panic and think the world has ended and you fail the test. None of those things are going to happen. What I do want you to do, though, is after you've given that first main idea, and you see you've still got 30 seconds on your clock, so you're only about halfway through that answer, I would encourage you to take a deep breath, take a few seconds extra of a pause, try your best to come up with the second main idea then. If you still can't, what I would recommend you do as the best case scenario there is to continue to give more details and develop the concept that you were just talking about. So again, if that one main idea, that's the only thing you can think of. So once again, I'll use a practical example, that giving advice question that I talked about earlier. If you're to give advice to a friend about what they should consider before they take a job overseas, and maybe the only piece of advice you could really think about would be to check out housing before you go. Make sure you can afford a place to live. So you've given a few examples, and then you just can't think of another piece of advice. Again, I would just continue talking about the housing affordability and keep going with that same idea since you've already started it. What you're trying to do, what you're hoping to achieve, is to demonstrate to the raters that you've got enough proficiency in English with your vocab, with your sentence structure, with your pronunciation, and your fluency. So even if you didn't get that second main idea, your content score might not be quite as high as you'd like, but you will be able to make up for it, we hope, in other areas. So speaking for the full 60 seconds, that's a check off that checklist. That'll help with your task fulfillment. Completing the role play. In that case, you're to talk to a friend and give them advice. So technically you would have done that. Maybe you just didn't develop so much. So I always say I try to look at the positive side, because I know tests can be very nerve-wracking, but always focus on what you can do and latch on to that and play to your own strengths rather than worry about the things that don't go exactly as you would like it on the test. And it's only one answer too. I have to say that you've got 8 speaking answers to give. So if one doesn't go quite as well as you would hope, I would like to think that you've got 7 more opportunities as this test moves forward to continue to demonstrate your best skills. And I'm sure there will be another question where you can come up with more than one main idea. So that's the name of the game. Just keep that test moving forward and try to just let go of the past and whatever maybe didn't work out. Focus on where you are now in the test and keep it moving forward. That's all you can do, is demonstrate as many language skills as you possibly can.
Thank you. Okay. So can I go over the word count for writing without losing marks? And then, because like somebody has asked a question in the comments and it's applicable right now. What happens if my speaking responses are too short, too long, and I get cut off?
Yeah, so again, if your speaking response is too short, it sort of depends on how short. Again, if it's a 60-second response and you've only talked for 30 seconds, as I just said earlier, you might have given a detail or two, but you're sort of giving away the second half of that question. So I do encourage you to keep your speech moving. Even if it's not the greatest idea in the world, at least you're saying something and you're allowing the raters to assess your vocabulary, your grammar, your sentence structure, and your actual speech delivery. As soon as the time on the speaking test is up, so if it's a 60-second question, you're speaking into that microphone. When that 60-second mark hits, it's actually the microphone will shut off. So even if you're in the middle of a sentence, you'll get cut off and we'll never get to hear the rest of that idea that you were discussing. If that does happen, it's not a problem at all, provided you've already answered the question fully. So it's not uncommon. Again, if you wanted to take one of our CELPIP speaking webinars, we go through lots of test taker answers. And in many of those examples that we share with you in the session, you'll hear that the test takers have given 3 or 4 quite wonderful and interesting ideas. And then right in their last sentence, they get cut off. I say that's not a problem. It's not going to affect their score. The raters are not looking for perfection from you. Again, they're looking for you to demonstrate that you've got enough proficiency to have that conversation and to communicate. So you don't need to worry about the small things like that. If it's obviously the end of your answer and you've got lots of details to prove that you've got a strong command of English, then that's okay as well. The writing count is sort of similar. On the test itself, the writing instructions will tell you to write between 150 to 200 words. So basically in 27 minutes, you have to write the email. In 26 minutes, you have to write your opinion piece in the second. It's a survey. Within that length of time, about 200 words, I think, is sufficient. It gives you a really good goal. You're not hoping to go over that by too much. But again, if you exceed it by a few words and you've given a wealth of interesting details, lots of strong sentence structure and grammar, and answer the question and so on, all of these other elements the raters are looking for, word count is such a small, minor thing. It's really not going to affect your score, provided we've understood the rest of the response. So don't stress the small stuff. That's an expression to use as well. If it's 10 words over, not the end of the world. 10 words over does not mean we can't understand what it was you were writing about in the first place. It's more of a matter of a guide for you. I think 200 words in 27 minutes is probably sufficient, especially when you're in the middle of a test anyway. Yeah, so not really big mistakes to make. I wouldn't worry too much about them. Try your best to follow instructions, but don't worry about big little things like that.
Okay, thank you. Oh, another thing that I thought was really important to convey in terms of like, there may be, some of you might have, Brad, you might have already said this, but I just thought that I should talk about it. Like you might think that finishing your speaking piece before the time limit, there might be some of you who think that, oh, I've said all I've said and I finished it sooner. That means that I've been able to convey what I had to concisely, and that might be a good thing. But you're actually giving away 20 seconds of opportunity to prove more of your skills. So don't lose that opportunity. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about. That's what I wanted to mention. Like, just because you've don't think that speaking sooner or giving your point sooner means it's better, because you're losing that 15-second opportunity. If you may be a level 9, but if somebody is a level 7 and they've been able to demonstrate their skills for longer than you have, then they might have the opportunity to get a better score than you, just because you lost that time. So make use of that time is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. Yeah, it bears reminding our viewers too. The more skill set you can demonstrate, the more the raters have to work with when they're giving you a score, because again, they're looking for strengths across those 4 categories. So yeah, try not to give away large chunks of your time, because you're really losing out on your opportunity to showcase your best ability. Yeah, so keep that speech moving. Even if it's not a great idea, just keep on moving forward.
Okay. Will I lose marks if my details aren't related to Canadian content? For example, could I discuss a dish that is common in India but not in Canada?
You can by all means bring in any content or details or ideas to your response that are interesting and actually answer the test question, whether they originate in Canada or not, like a traditional dish that you enjoyed in another part of the world. If for some reason the question's asking you to talk about a family experience you enjoyed and you discussed this big banquet that you went to in India, perfectly fine and very welcomed. Yeah, so again, CELPIP itself is a Canadian test that you would use to immigrate to Canada, but it doesn't mean that you can't bring with you ideas from your own cultural background too. So yes, any ideas at all that make sense for the question are definitely encouraged to bring into the test, especially if they're very specific and precise. All right, now the one thing I will caution though is if it's a word or a term that maybe isn't so obvious, it might be in your best interest to give enough detail to explain what that is. So if you just mentioned the name of a dish that isn't common here, and the reader or the listener didn't understand what that was because you didn't explain it, then that might not be such a great idea. But yeah, if you're mentioning it and then you're explaining what it is and how it's relevant, definitely bring it into the response for sure. Yeah, more interesting that way. And Canada's a very diverse country anyway. So we get people from all over the world that live here. So it's welcomed, I think, to bring those ideas in for the test as well, not just for living here.
Okay. Does my spelling count as part of my score, and can I use British or American spelling without losing marks?
Yes and yes. So yeah, your spelling is just a little teeny tiny dot on that big long Rader's checklist that we looked at. It's only one element. Spelling itself, we try to spell our words properly. But again, if you make a spelling mistake and it's so tiny, I bet you 9 out of 10 people might not even notice that spelling mistake. So it's really not, again, one of those major mistakes that we have to worry about too much. But hopefully we are spelling the words correctly. If you wanted to use British or American spellings, that's perfectly fine. If you'd like to know the Canadian spellings, that's perfectly fine too. They're really not that different after all. The one thing I would advise though is just for consistency's sake, choose one pattern and stick with it. So again, if you're going with the American spellings, which are the ER endings, stick with that all the way through. If you wanted to use Canadian spellings, which would be RE endings, that's fine too, but just stick with that all the way through. I think you're demonstrating to the raters at that point that you understand the rules a little bit better. But again, spelling on its own is so small. To make a spelling mistake into a major deal, we'd honestly have to look at the words on the screen and not have a clue what the word is you're trying to spell. So that would be a major mistake. But if you've just missed a letter, like it's a double L, but you only put one L, most of us wouldn't even notice that kind of thing anyway. So as I say, as always, do your best. Be consistent, but spelling's not that big of a deal, provided we know what the word is. If that makes sense. In the grand scheme of things anyway, there are worse mistakes you could make, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Okay. How much does grammar and syntax matter during the speaking test? Do they hold more weight than good vocabulary? Brandy, could you also tell us what syntax is?
Yes, exactly. So syntax itself, I always used to think of syntax in an easier term as maybe the phrasing or the group of words that you're writing down or that you're speaking aloud. So I think most languages, I'll say, in the world have some sort of a pattern that we roughly follow. In English, Most often that happens to be subject, verb, object. I eat the apple. So that's sort of the basic building block that we learn as we're learning the English language. That pattern is different in other languages. I believe Spanish is opposite to that. We used to work alongside, Ashwati and I used to have another colleague named Tanya that is Spanish speaking, and I try to sometimes figure out what she was writing about in Spanish, and I got confused because the order of some of those ideas is different. So again, it's a matter of understanding in English, how do we build those structures? And then I guess going from there. So as long as you've got the basic patterns of your sentence, we can start to understand the overall idea. So somebody who's working more at a beginner level, if they're just starting off their English studies, it makes sense then that they probably are going to have more grammatical mistakes and writing mistakes than somebody who's been studying for a while. But even if our grammar mistakes are obvious, provided we've got the syntax down pat, so that basic element or structural of the sentence is there, we can start to understand the meaning a little bit better. So I think the biggest takeaway I can express with the writing elements as far as grammar is concerned, if you're making the types of writing and grammar mistakes that are so, your mistakes make it so difficult for anybody reading to fully understand what it is you're talking about, then that's a major grammatical error that's going to have a negative impact as well on your score. And some of these types of mistakes, just off the top of my head, I've been teaching for 24 years. So a lot of the English mistakes I see that are more serious would be things like, honestly, verb tenses can be very confusing. If we're not writing in the same tense, or if we're mixing and matching all these verb tenses, it's really confusing for the reader to understand. Sometimes the sentence structure issues, we call them fragments, which is like a half of an idea, or we call them run-on sentences, which might be 2, 3, or even 4 ideas just lumped into one gigantic line where the reader doesn't understand where your ideas begin and end. So those types of mistakes would definitely affect or even prevent the reader from understanding what it is you're trying to write. So that would have a negative effect. But again, if it's a matter of a subject-verb agreement error and you accidentally got it wrong, instead of he eats, you said he eat, we'd recognize the mistake, but we still know what you mean. So that kind of a mistake, if you make a lot of them, sure, they're going to add up. But if you just make a few mistakes like that once in a while, they're not going to affect your score half as much as making these really major grievous errors would. Yeah, so I know it's hard sometimes. There's so many different grammar rules in English. But if you can just think to yourself, what can I do to make it the easiest thing possible for my reader to understand what I'm trying to say? If you can just keep that rule in the back of your head and do your best to demonstrate that, then you're coming out ahead of the game. Even with mistakes, you'll still score a little bit better per se than somebody who's written a whole bunch of words on screen and we honestly don't know what the idea is. So yeah, interesting.
Also interesting how, like we're talking about syntax and phrasing. Also interesting how there is like an unsaid rule that everybody follows when they're describing an object. I mean, this is not directly related to the CELPIP test, but like if you're describing, if you're trying to talk, if there's a ball in front of you and you're trying to describe it, you would say, I can see a big red ball, but you would never say, I can see a red big ball. Like, who decided the order that the shape and the color, shape comes before color? That's so interesting. Like, if you had to throw in another object, like the big red round ball, the round, like, so, you know, like that part, like, it definitely sounds off if somebody says, look, there's a red big ball instead of big red ball.
Yeah. Yeah. These are rules. Again, that type of mistake wouldn't be as serious because even though it's not natural, it doesn't follow the rule. I don't know who created that rule either. I know exactly what you're saying. Why do we have this rule in English? Who knows? But that's just the way it's done. But yeah, mixing the order of your words there would seem a bit unnatural, but we still know what you're saying at least, right? Yeah. It's not the end of the world. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, English is tough now that I really think it through. All these languages have their rules and their exceptions, don't they?
Okay, so we're so we have the last question here, and then we can go over the questions that we're getting in the comments. Can I ask for my writing or speaking tests to be re-evaluated? How does that work?
Yes. So once you get your score report, so after you finish taking CELPIP, you will get your score report within 3 to 4 business days. So when you see whatever scores you've received on that test, you're going to have a separate score for the listening, reading, writing, speaking. So 4 individual scores there. Your listening and reading tests are marked by the computer, keeping that in mind. So there's not really any sense at all, I think, to request a reevaluation because the computer is not going to change its mind. Those things are set. And it does cost money to ask for a reevaluation. So you're not going to want to throw your money away, hoping that the computer will suddenly change its mind and give you more marks for listening and reading. That won't happen. As far as the writing and the speaking sections go, these are the two sections that are assessed by the human raters. So if you disagree with your level score, let's say you got a level 8 on your speaking, but you feel that you should have earned a level 9, you can apply for what's called a reevaluation. So what that means is you're asking for a fresh set of raters to come on board and give your speaking test another look, just to make sure they've not missed anything, to see if there's a chance that your score might come up. So if that is the case, you would have to fill out a reevaluation form. They're available on the website, or you would contact customer service. Once you fill out that request form, you do pay the reevaluation fee. I don't have the exact dollar amount for you now because it would vary depending on which country and currency you're going to be taking the CELPIP test in, and also how many parts you want to be reevaluated. If it's just the speaking you want to have another look at, the cost is going to be different, say, than if you asked for a reevaluation for writing and speaking together. So again, when you fill out this form, you would find out the cost there. We'll just leave it at that for ease of this episode today. But again, when you make that request, keep in mind, as soon as you've made that request, you must pay the fee immediately, and that's non-refundable. So even if you do change your mind tomorrow, there's no way to you can cancel out the request, all right, but you won't get the refund. So if you're wanting a reevaluation, make sure you're confident and ready to go through with the process as well. So what happens, again, we'll just use speaking as an example. So remember, in the regular test, at least 3 different speakers would rate your speaking test. So if you request that reevaluation, a different 3 people, 3 raters, are going to now look or listen to your speaking responses. So different people than before. And the process is exactly the same. All anonymous. These 3 people will go through the 8 speaking tests, give you a score, etc. If on the rough perchance the reevaluation score is different from the original score you received, so let's say this new group of raters said, yeah, we're going to give this a level 9. If that is the case, then you would be refunded the registration fee that you paid for that service. So that money comes back to you. If, on the other hand, the score remains exactly the same, so maybe the first time you got level 8, this new batch of raters say it's a level 8, then you do not get the refund and nothing happens basically, right? So I hope that, and also you must apply for the reevaluation within 6 months of your test date. So that's important as well. You can't just wait a full year and decide that you'd like it retested. So again, it's within a 6-month period. I feel like there's one thing I'm missing. Right, last thing I wanted to mention too is your new score. Whether again it's the same score as before or if it's changed, you'll get that updated score within, I'm going to say, 1 to 2 weeks. It doesn't come back quite as quickly as the official test. Again, because there are so many people writing CELPIP. So your reevaluation request will be done promptly, but you can expect the score report for that requested reevaluation to land in your account within 1 to 2 weeks of the request time. And I think that's all I can recall off the top of my head. I hope that answers the question anyway. Yeah, good to know that it's an option for you anyway.
Thank you. So we'll go through a few of the questions that we got. So some of these are not scoring related. Some of them are. I will try to make it as accurate to our episode as possible. Okay, so hang on. Okay. What could actually cause a low score in reading even when you were sure of your answers?
Well, if you're sure of your answers, but you're not getting them correct, I guess that could mean a variety of different things. It either means that you're reading too quickly and you're missing the nuance of what the question is actually asking you to do. I'll give you a good example of this. This just happened in a webinar I did yesterday. It might be practical and make you consider what's happening. My webinar was all about speaking and listening, but it's the same concept. So I was asking aloud, I was role playing out with my test takers, and I asked them aloud, I said, how much would the lowest price option of these business cards be if I were to buy them? And I would say 75% of my viewers online, it was a Zoom class, they all started telling me the business style. They said, oh, you want to go buy the hybrid or the basic style? I said, no, that's not what I asked. I said, how much how much is the lowest price option? I want to know the dollar amount. And then they all went, oh, okay, that's $14.99. So again, had I not prompted them to catch their mistake, 3/4 of them would have gotten that test question wrong. It wasn't a real test. We were just practicing. So that sometimes is the case. I don't know. I think sometimes we're nervous, we're tired, we're trying to get through this test as quickly as we can. So maybe we're just not reading the questions carefully enough to fully understand what it is we're looking for. Because that's a big difference, understanding the price of something versus the style of something. Those are two completely different things. So that could be one thing. And I can rest assured that my audience was dead confident that they had the answer right. I said, wait a minute, you're not even answering my question. So that could be something. The other element, I guess, could be just a vocabulary issue as well. On the CELPIP test, I wouldn't expect anybody coming into this test to know every single word and the meaning. I mean, our brains themselves are not computers. So I think you could best serve yourself for reading in particular here, Chica, by really practicing at home your strategies for decoding or guessing the meaning of unfamiliar words. I think that would probably help anybody score a little bit better. Because again, on CELPIP, when you get into reading parts 3 and 4, these are the advanced level parts of the test. So somebody scoring perfectly in reading part 4 is probably getting a level 12 in their reading, which is the highest score you might achieve anyway. So these people have probably practiced and maybe not mastered, but strongly developed the ability to look at a sentence, understand there's this 1 or 2 words here that I've never seen before. But because I do understand the words before and after it, I could probably make a pretty strong guess as to what the meaning is here. And then using those context clues, you can then look at your answer choices and select the one that makes the most sense. What I just described to you is a higher level skill set that does take practice to develop. But I think those skills sounds like anyway something that maybe they're mentioning here. And I'll leave that with all of our viewers, whether you want to take a webinar with us or just practice these skills on your own. So those would be the two common areas to think about anyway to do better on your test.
Thank you. Okay, this is a quick question for you. In speaking part 3, does the picture remain on screen while we're speaking?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So speaking task 3 asks you to describe some things that are happening in the picture as best as you can. So the whole time you're talking into your microphone, you'll be able to see that picture on screen, and then you get to decide what you want to talk about. So I like that question. I think it's easiest in the sense that in 60 seconds, you're never going to have time to talk about everything anyway. So you'll never run out of time. There's so much in that picture. So you get to decide which parts of it are easiest for you to speak about. Yeah, look at the picture and keep talking till 60 seconds is up.
Okay. For listening section, do we have time to finish writing down or reading through our notes after each audio clip, like in the practice test when you have to click next to get to the questions?
Okay, so I understand why you're asking. So in a practice test, if you've ever gone to our website, celpip.ca, we've got 2 free practice tests there. And because they're practice, you yourselves get to decide if you want to go backwards and do a question again, or when you want to go forward. In the real test though, and this is described briefly in the practice test, but in the real test, the entire CELPIP test for listening and all other parts, they move forward automatically. So when you start any part, let's say listening part 1, I forget how many minutes off the top of my head you get for that one. But anyway, you've got a certain number of minutes on screen. Oh, sorry. You'll have 30 seconds for every single question there for listening part 1, I recall. So you get to answer your question. If you finish answering the question before the timer is over, you could click next to move forward yourself. But you can also sit and wait. And as soon as the timer on your screen for that question counts down to 0, the computer is going to move you forward automatically anyway. So you do have a little bit of flexibility in the real test, depending on how much time you need. By the time you get to part 4 in listening and to part 6, you actually get a chunk of minutes on screen. Could be 9 minutes, let's say. And maybe you've got 7 questions to read through and answer. So same thing. You'll answer all of those questions, we hope, before the timer gets to 0. Because the moment the timer does get to 0, the test will move forward with or without you. So whatever you've got written in there for your answers is going to be sent off to the computer for marking as well. Yeah, so there's not really any pause per se. As I say, when that timer gets to 0, the test moves on automatically. So that's not a feature you can control. Yeah, good question, Mary. No one's ever asked me that before, but I do understand why you're asking, because again, the practice format is just slightly more flexible to help you study than the real test. So I think that's a really good question to note.
Okay. I find listening the most difficult part, scoring high on reading, but only 6 in listening. How many general meaning questions are there in listening?
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't think there's a rule that goes into counting the number of general meaning, specific info, or inference questions. What I can tell you with certainty, though, I can't tell you the percentage or the exact number, but remember, the listening and reading tests are going to become more challenging as the test moves forward. So we'll take listening as your example here, VK. So you've got 6 parts in listening. Listening part 1 will probably feel the easiest to you because the vocabulary is going to be a little more relatable. Probably the lengths of the sentences that you're hearing and the grammar structures are a little bit more common as well. And even the questions you're answering will probably be a little easier to digest. By the time you work your way towards the end of listening, so maybe that's parts 5 and 6 for the listening test, you are going to notice the vocab has stepped it up. So there probably will be more words that maybe you're not as familiar with. Sentences are longer, grammar constructs are a little more challenging. The types of questions are going to become harder too. So of the 3 types of questions, like general meaning, specific information, and inference questions, I would say, are very likely the most challenging for most of the test takers I work with. Inference skills require you to use logic and reasoning to choose the best answer choice based on what you've been listening to. So again, your answer choices aren't even stated directly in the conversations you're hearing, but you will have heard enough information to put it together and looking at those answer choices, making the most logical choice. So you can expect for sure to encounter more of those inference type questions in the last parts of this test, because again, it's designed to be more challenging. Keeping in mind, people who are answering, say, listening parts 5 and 6 questions mostly correctly, these are your people getting levels 11 and 12, the advanced levels in CELPIP listening. And that's why the test is set up that way. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Again, there's no rule to say you have to have this number of general meaning, this number. That I can't tell you, but I can definitely say expect to have more inference type questions and probably fewer specific information questions in the last part. Specific info questions are easier. That's why. Really tests you out to see how advanced your skills are. Yeah, good question, VK. Thanks for asking that.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions we have for you today, Brandy. There are a couple of questions that, one, we cannot answer, and then 2 that are more like related for more easier for me to answer. So good luck to everybody who has their test. A couple of them, I think one of them has their test in 5 hours today, and then there's another one.
Yeah, I see that. Just written in 6
time,
p.m.
so good luck to all of you. I hope you get the score you need.
All right. Thanks. Hopefully, yeah. Good luck, everybody. And yeah, if you've got any more questions about scoring, let us know in our socials, and we'll get back to you. Thanks for having me, Ashwani.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you next time.
So there are 2 questions here that I just want to quickly address. So there's one about what score do I need to have to pass for citizenship, and then what is the average pass grade required for my PR application. So these are questions for the IRCC. We don't have the answers to this question. You will find it on the IRCC website. All we do is give you your scores, and then I think your score requirements are different based on which PR application you're going for, and then there's something else for citizenship. So I would encourage you to check the IRCC website and find out the answer. There's another question here about reevaluation and if your previous score can reduce. No. Your score, if you apply for a reevaluation, your score will either stay the same as it was or it will increase. It will not decrease. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And let me know in the comments below if you have another episode that you'd like, if you have any other information that you'd like to get about CELPIP. So the scoring episode was based off of all the questions we got about scoring in the last episode. So definitely let us know in the comments if there's any specific topic, any section, or just in general anything you'd like to know about the CELPIP test. And if we can make an episode out of it, we will. But thank you for subscribing to our channel. And if you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up. And please also share it with anybody who you think might find it useful. I haven't forgotten the trivia question. The vernal equinox falls on March 19, 2024. What does the Latin word equinox mean in English? And the answer is equal night. Somebody ahead said it means equinox means equal amount of daylight and darkness, and I guess I'll give it to you. Congratulations. Anyway, that's it for today. Our next episode will be on the 7th of March. Please do join us then. You'll find more information about the topic on our socials. See you then. Bye.